All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back. Nice to see everybody. Very excited to be joined by you all. Also excited to have Don Ans with us. So Don and I have known Don for at least probably 15 years. Don is ex Manitoba Hydro. Spent roughly 32 years with Manitoba Hydro, doing all things related to engineering services, generating station services, controls, maintenance, testing, commissioning, and then obviously asset management. And so Don, I guess when you and I met and started working together, I believe you had started the process of I guess, implementing the asset management division or group, within Manitoba Hydro. So many years of experience. So good to have you with us. So this is our last module 8 of 8. So this is it. So at the end of the day here, same process. You'll fill out knowledge checks, exit survey questions. You'll get your PDH for module 8, but you're gonna get a very nice completion certificate. More to come on that here later on in the day, but I'll show that off to you all and maybe suggest to you different ways you might want to leverage that here going forward. Relative to makeup policy, given that this is our last module together, I just dropped in the chat here a refresh on how long the content will be open to you all. So that'll be 4 weeks after today. That if that window of availability expires, what do? I put that in there as well. Just drop Kate, Aaron, or myself an email, and like I said, we're very flexible. We'll open that back up to you and help you seek whatever it is you're looking for. And then very much like today, these are all recorded. So the recordings are all housed within the learning management system. We've been over that before. And again, so if you've missed a module along the way, you can go back and I guess watch the class and fill out the knowledge checks, et cetera, et cetera. So any questions on any of that? No? Anybody have issues logging in this morning to the LMS? No? Okay. So relative to the day flow, the agenda is attached, as always, as part of the meeting invitation. I'll put it up on the screen here. But we do try and stick to these break times, as you all know. So between 12:45 and 1:15 p.m. Eastern, we'll take our first 30-minute break. We'll be rigid with those times in the event that you guys have meetings planned or et cetera, et cetera. And then we'll take our second break from 3 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. And again, we'll be rigid there as well. Don, anything to add?
No, just from my side, I'm a pretty informal teacher. So if, anybody has any questions, you can certainly just, turn on your camera, raise your hand. Chris will be watching in the chat. So, anytime you'd like to discuss something further, please just, do something to bring your you to my attention, and then we'll have a further discussion.
Yeah. Anything more on your background that you wanted to add?
Not really. In terms of, for me, I've been around since the beginning of asset management. And so I've seen a lot of companies, how they, and including my own, how it all started out and how it's grown and now headed to where now there's an ISO standard around it and everything. So, I certainly, if you have questions particular to how it's evolved in your company or how you'd like to evolve it, Be really interested in that. Also, quite interested in, in how, in your experience with asset management as we go along. So if you want to bring that, to any of your questions, that'd be great. But otherwise, right, ready to go, Chris.
Awesome. All right, John. So I'll give you the screen.
Good. Shall see if the world actually works. Good. Does that look big and ugly?
Looks nice.
Good. Excellent. So if anybody sees my eyes flashing left, I'm running on dual screen. So I've got the presentation up on my left, and I've got the looking at everybody's face on the right. So if you see me looking left, it's not because I'm just filling up my coffee. Good. So module overview. So today what we're planning on is a deeper dive into asset management. This was also covered in the 1 hour course. And in 1 hour, talking about asset management is kind of like drinking from a fire hose. Today should be give you time to really think about all the different things that are required for asset management and how it relates to your work and your utility. I'll be using the ISO standard as a reference for most of this module. And more than anything, you'll find with asset management is you have to have something to look at to get the language. So just to figure out all the different deliverables, what asset management's all about. So there's a couple standards in the world, and I'll talk about them as we go through the presentation. But I've based it right around the ISO standard because it's publicly available, and I can use that for the training material. And I'll be looking at also the key aspects, aligning that to hydro generation. So mapping them to the processes in a hydro utility so that you can understand, like, it's not just an ISO standard. This is what you would be doing in your work at the utility. And I'll be talking about asset reliability as it relates to asset management. This isn't, a reliability engineering course. So I'm not going to be going through the details, mean time between failures, all of that good stuff. But I'll be talking about reliability, how it relates to asset management. So the objectives. So the start of this course is an introduction to asset management, the key objectives and benefits and the scope, just so you have an idea of what it's all about. Then I'll be taking a deeper dive into the 7 aspects of asset management. So again, this is from the standard. So the organizational context, the AM decision making, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance management, evaluation, and improvement. I'll be helping you understand some of the challenges of asset management in a hydro utility. And you can see that, especially as you go around North America, you can see that there's a lot of companies struggling with how to put things together, get a lot of things established to support asset management. And then I'll be helping you understand how some of the established hydro processes align with asset management. So that's the objectives for the day. You can tell me at the end if we managed to achieve them. So the outline, I've tied this to your agenda. So if you've got the agenda up on another screen, uh, the agenda item 2 is the first thing we'll be going through. It takes about half an hour. Then we'll be going through the key asset management requirements as through all those different areas. The one we'll be spending most of the time on is planning. That's where most of the work is done in asset management. So I'll be spending a lot of the time there. And then we've got a summary right at the end. And depending on how the timing works, we may skip that one just to, see how we work right at the end. This is the whole second time that I presented this. So last time it ran just about perfectly to our agenda. So we'll see how we do. So starting with our introduction to asset management. So what is it? So if you look at the ISO standard, the the definition of asset management is the coordinated activity of an organization to realize value from its assets. So seems like a fairly simple uh, explanation, but the really what I've found from an asset management perspective, what is important? The first thing is coordinated activity. So you will find, depending on what your utility is like right now, you will have a lot of the activities in place that I'm going to talk about. But if you don't have a formal asset management group in place, those activities will tend to be uncoordinated. So you'll see like capital planning, all of those things will be happening, but they may not be worked together to achieve the best efficiency for the company. So what gives you that coordinated activity is you've got leadership alignment. So that gets you to make sure your leaders are all pushing the same way or pulling. Alignment of decisions with organizational objectives. So that's that alignment to the strategic plan, and it would be planned, documented, and measurable. When you look at value, so value can be positive and negative impacts, financial and non-financial, on stakeholders over the life cycle. So you'll be seeing, as this is one of the changes that happens with asset management, is the introduction of risk measurement and looking at that risk and how it's impacted by your assets, and that using that to help you make decisions on what to do with those assets. And then finally, assets from a hydro utility, the biggest one that we care about, of course, are the physical assets. But this same thinking can be applied to a thing or an entity. So, for example, if you were in a software firm, you could look at the asset management of that software. So the software would be an asset. And matter of fact, as most companies, as they move forward with asset management, they start with the physical assets, and then they start looking at the other parts of especially their software assets, et cetera. So now, what are some of the decisions that you would expect to see from an asset management side? Like what, especially in a hydro utility, what decisions are part of asset management? So the first thing is, what is an asset expected to do? And you may think that's straightforward, but you'd be surprised how many companies don't have the what an asset is supposed to do documented anywhere. And especially, as your company gets older, you have people change. It's surprising how quickly that knowledge gets lost. So it's really important to understand what your asset is expected to do. How long is it expected to last, the expected lifetime? Uh, you've seen this in asset management of infrastructure, like your cities and towns. Uh, People never thought of this for many years, and now all of a sudden they call it aging infrastructure. It really came down to the fact nobody had a timeline for how long all of these assets were supposed to last, and therefore they didn't know what investments they were supposed to have in place to keep them in place. What's the impact of failure? So how do you know which assets affect you the most? What maintenance is required to ensure that it can perform its intended purpose? Who will perform the work? Is it internal or is it external? Tools and training requirements for all of that. What spare parts are required? What data is required to operate and maintain the asset? What is the condition of the asset? How is it performing? When should the asset be replaced or refurbished, and how should the asset be disposed of at end of life? These are all typical asset management decisions. And you can quickly see, like within many firms, a lot of these decisions are handled by different groups. And that's where now with asset management coordinating it pulls this all together. So you're really trying to optimize, the life cycle investments for over the life of that asset. And isn't that the coolest trash rake you've ever seen?
Looking good.
Yeah. Yeah. So your reference standards. So if anybody wanted to look into this more fully, these are the standards to look at. And it'll help, just by looking at this list of standards, it'll help you understand just how broad asset management is and how it starts to dig into other areas. So the first three, the 55,000, oops, I see I'm missing a zero. Chris, I have to make a note to add my zero.
All right.
So
Noted.
55,000. 55,001 and 55,002. Those are the three main ones. And you'll see most of this presentation today will be to do with 55,001. And that's basically just says this is all the stuff that you have to have asset management fully in place. But then what they found is that asset management starts to run into finance. Yeah, you may think of the process used for capital planning, for sure, and now your O&M budgets. Well, now you have to start talking, well, you have to talk to finance people then. So how do you align with finance? That's 55,010. Public policy development, because of course now you're looking at external risks, so it ran into public policy. Uh, you'll see there's a lot to talk about with people. So there's the people aspects of asset management in 55,012, and then they talk specifically about data assets in 13. So those are all the ISO standards that arose from asset management as a standard. When I started out, there was three competing areas for getting information from because the ISO standard didn't come out right away. So PAS 55 was one of the originals that came out of England, and basically it was the originator, I think, for asset management. You also run into a group called the IAM. They have a lot of publicly available information, and you can join quite easily if you wanted more in-depth information. They have taken the ISO standards and translated it into, I would say, a little more usable information. Um, with the one that, and they've actually got people that will come and audit you from the IAM perspective. The one thing I would say is that it now you've actually now taken a step away from the standard, so it actually has more information, but but it's somebody translating the standard for you. And one thing I find from IAM is and PAS 55 and the next one, they're not particular to electric utilities or hydrogeneration. So they are particular to asset management in any company, so any asset intensive company. And the final one is IPWEA. So they actually were one of the pioneers. As a matter of fact, one of the first people worked in asset management was out of Australia. And so if you look at them, they have a lot of interesting areas that they got interested in asset management when the major electrical field feeds to Auckland, to one of the major cities in Australia, when they failed and nobody had a contingency plan and nobody had ever looked at the risk. And so that was one of the drivers for Australia being very early into asset management. And they had a standard for their whole country. So that's where this all came from. So that's it. If you wanted to dig any deeper, there's your sources. And there's a really cool dam from Mozambique for anybody who's ever been there. So now, why would people want to get into asset management? It looks like a lot of paperwork, a lot of processes to cover. Well, what's your driver for getting into it? The first one, one of the major drivers is improving financial performance. That coordination of activities, making decisions based on risk. One of the big things is to improve your financial performance as a company. The second one would be to have informed decision making. So you now will have a process for making decisions instead of it basically being the size of the plant manager that says how much money is going to be spent. Enhanced risk management. So decisions are based on risk. People understand the risk based on their assets, so that's very important. Improve services and outputs because as the coordination and documentation of processes gets better, people start to do things better and then they interact more in a more coordinated fashion. Demonstrated social responsibility. So that's very important in some areas to be able to say that you're actually considering your social and stakeholder responsibilities. Especially in some areas like I know where the dams that I used to work at, they were all in Aboriginal areas. They impacted local communities. It was very important to consider that in making your decisions. Demonstrated compliance. Compliance is part of your risk. Enhanced reputation. So by making better decisions and considering all these other people, then it helps your reputation. Improved organizational sustainability. So that's that higher efficiency and also looking at it from a life cycle perspective. So you replace things, before things are emergencies. And then the improved efficiency and effectiveness, I've kind of referred to that all through this. Again, it comes through the coordination side. So there's a lot of drivers in there. And that's the good official part. This, from my experience, is the real reasons why people put them in. So first of all would be shareholder regulator requirements to justify expenditures. I see this, when publicly regulated utilities or people that have to report to the board, and they're all saying, what money do you really have to spend? They typically tend to focus on your big capital expenditures, but they it really gets away from the begging for money. You have a transparent method of making decisions, and you've got a consistent method that you can stand in front of them and show it. It's not like you're individually justifying each project. The other thing you see is capitalized capital or levelized capital spending. So people don't like to see at a board or at an executive board or public utility side, they don't want to see this really irregular spending because now you've got to be looking for money above your normal targets. So one of the other gains for that is that levelized capital spending. Also see some companies put it in because of response to failure. So if they have a really big failure and then they have to go out to the public and say, well, we really missed this, one of their typical reactions or what they have to do to mitigate that is to put asset management into place. When they start heading to license renewals, so the asset management, it helps to facilitate the information for those license renewal applications. And then the final thing, I've seen some companies put it in because one of their executive sees asset management and it's a great idea to put it in. So I got to support that. But um, it used to be a shiny term, and actually in some companies though it's deemed to be a negative term, because they think everything's asset management. And unfortunately, from my experience over time, everything does become asset management, and it just because you're starting to coordinate all these functions. So you'll see that leadership will come in, and then if they're not, they need to be at a senior level to make this happen, and we'll be talking about that in the next section. So what's included in asset management? So now this is directly from the ISO standard, and this is really now the outline to what I'll be talking about today. So I'll be using this as the various sections that we'll be talking about, and to guide, if you were to look at from a really high level and you looked at that whole ISO standard, what are the sections that you would make sure you'd want to have addressed? So this is what I would use. So the first thing that when you put asset management in is you really have to look at the context of your organization. And that includes your stakeholder expectations, your system scope, what assets are included, what processes are included, uh, the AM system implementation and continuous improvement, decision making. So what is your value framework? How do you make decisions in your company? Everything to do about leadership. So commitment, your asset management policy, and roles and responsibilities. And you can tell that, these are the kind of things that vary with time as you start with asset management and as you grow. You'll get more processes, you'll figure out who does what. But it's very important to have a documented policy in place and decide who's doing these things. Planning, action. So this is where we'll be spending a lot of time. And you can imagine coming up with the actions to address risks and opportunities. That's where a lot of the work in your company is done. Trying to figure out what are your risks, what you should be doing uh, to invest to mitigate those risks. Everything from maintenance to capital, all of those good things. So we'll be spending a lot of time talking there. And then the strategic asset management plan, the SAMP, and the AMP, the asset management plans down at the asset class levels. We actually have an exercise today to look at a SAMP, and so you'll be able to see what, all of these things that I'm going to talk about today to show you a physical example. Support. You can imagine all of this stuff doesn't happen without looking at resources, competence, awareness, communication, documentation, data and information, and knowledge. A lot of work has been spent on this. This is where your IT systems that support asset management, that's where they would be housed, and the decisions you will find that asset management as it grows tends to impose standards on your asset management supporting systems, because you have to be able to pull data to make asset management decisions. So there's a lot of work on asset management in these areas. Operation, that's operation of the assets. So, your actual work on the asset throughout its life cycle management, control of change. So you've got assets that are being changed throughout its life, and then various external processes, products, and services. Performance evaluation. This is separate, but of course it feeds back into these other areas for planning. So you're looking at your monitoring analysis, internal audit, and management review. All of these processes are used to give you to identify ideas to either improve your asset performance or to look at improvement of processes. And then finally, for anybody who's seen any ISO standards before, there's the continuous improvement, and these are corrective actions and preventative actions. Every ISO standard has these, and it's basically processes so that if something fails, that you take the appropriate actions. So that is the uh, outline for what I'll cover our presentation for today. As I go into each section, I'll highlight, which area we're talking about, and then we'll go through the different deliverables and processes that are part of these processes.
Don, question. Under planning, you've got SAMP and AMP. What's the
Yes.
difference again?
And so I have slides on it as we go. So the Strategic Asset Management Plan, or SAMP, sits between the corporate business plan, like your utility business plan, and then the detailed plans at each asset or asset class. And those are the AMPs. So you can see, so it's basically, it'd be a strategic plan for asset management. And it shouldn't have all the details down right at an asset class. Those are in the AMPs.
Got it.
Okay. So just summarizing that section, the ISO 55000 series of standards defines asset management as coordinated activities to obtain value from assets. Asset management benefits include all the improved performance, financial performance, informed decision-making, enhanced risk management, and increased organizational sustainability and efficiency. Implementation of asset management is often initiated in response to requirements for increased capital funding due to aging assets. That's certainly my number one. And these are all the different aspects of what the ISO standard. And I think that is the end of section 1. So how did I do in timing, Chris?
You did that it's 11:30, so
Ooh, that is right to the minute.
there you go.
Wow. Okay, let's see if I do as well through the rest. Good. So the key asset management requirements. So this is where, like I said, we're going to go through each of our different sections. So this is my intro for each of the different sections of what's included. So you can see I've just highlighted the areas. If you were to go through the standard, you're going to find a lot more. When I talk about one or two slides of stakeholder expectations, for example, I'm summarizing it for you so that everything fits into a 5-hour course. There's a lot more detail if you're to go look in the standard itself. And if you wanted to look in the IAM equivalent of the standard. So this will give you the high level introduction, down to within 5 hours worth of training. Typically for somebody to be an asset management practitioner, it's about a 1-week course where you'd actually get down to the point where you could actually audit companies and start to see if they had all of the different areas for asset management covered. So that'll tell you the level that I've written everything to get sort of a 1-week detail course with an actual test down to a 5-hour. So that's the depth that I've written everything. So the first thing for trying to develop, to learn what your company should be doing from an asset management perspective, the first thing to look at is stakeholder expectations. Now, this is typically done within a leadership group within the company, and they would be looking at who are my stakeholders, and you would typically include internal and external, and what are their expectations from an asset management perspective. So if you looked at All of these, now this would be very a typical group that you would find. You would be looking at government. So of course, government would be multiple levels. So you are going to have uh, wherever you have facilities. So if you have, for example, a hydro generating station in a town or city or near one, yeah, yeah. And are they in the U.S. Are they called municipalities?
It would.
So yeah,
Yeah, for the
so you're going
most
to end up
part,
with
sure. They're
good. So
municipal corporations, so they're municipalities.
ah, okay. So you're going to have multiple levels of government to look at. Um, Customers. So obviously, if you are publicly, whether you're publicly regulated or whether you're private, you will have customers to look at and satisfy. Some generation companies just sell to transmission companies. Others have an integrated transmission and distribution group within the company, so therefore the customers are right down to the actual customer level. So you may have different levels of customers. You'll have investors, of course, and shareholders. You'll have regulators. So there's all kinds of regulators, especially around the hydro area, because you're influencing waterways. You've you've got licenses that you have to satisfy. So there's all kinds of regulators. There's the executive of the company. You will have the local communities that are affected. Um, and you can imagine how broad this gets. If you have um, impoundments or reservoirs, you're going to have people like fishing groups. You're going to have recreational groups, all of these people to consider. And then finally, you've got your employees, so all of the people that are actually working in the company. So all of these stakeholders, they will have requirements of you. And the risks are how those stakeholders are impacted. So the risks that you end up would include safety risks. You'd have dam safety risks, environmental, regulatory compliance, license requirements, cost, revenue loss, performance. All of this stuff will come out. And you start to then by going through your stakeholders, what their expectations are, and then the risks of that impact those expectations. That's your foundation for asset management. Now, at the time that you're working in your utility, those dams have been in place for a long time. You probably know who the expectations are or who your stakeholders are. But with asset management, the idea is to document that because now you've got people so that you really can understand the foundation for making decisions because that's what this is all about. Now, the scope of the system. So I don't know how everybody's eyes are for this. I've got a bigger picture of it on the next next slide. It isn't meant for you to know to read every one of these processes that are in this document, but this reflects my experience with asset management. Is that when before asset management starts in a company, the company's been running along successfully for a long time, right? You've been running the assets, so you've had O&M people, you've had you've been replacing things. There's a capital program. There's an operating budget, for employees for doing your maintenance. You've got maintenance contracts. All of this stuff has been happening. So what comes in now when asset management starts is starting to pull all of those things together. So you see the new stuff that asset management starts to do. That's all these processes over here. And now what happens is over time, and that's why I've drawn a nice red circle around here, is those processes start to integrate together. And so you end up with the asset management group helping to pull some of those decisions that the individual groups were making before, starting to coordinate those together and move it together and in some of these planning areas. So I suspect that if you were to look at your individual company, you'd be able to see where all of these processes are and who's responsible for them and whether you have asset management and what parts that they fulfill. Every single company that I've ever worked with does this a little bit differently depending on how they started, what changes they decided to make with asset management. None of them are right or wrong. It really comes down to what worked for the culture and organization of your company. some of the things that I've ran into that, especially started to allude to tie in the asset management side were so safety management systems, the environmental management, dam safety, NERC compliance, some of the licensing groups, finance and HR, they all have a lot of standards as well. So pulling all those together is also a challenge when you start with asset management. Now, the other part that is in your asset management scope is the asset portfolio. So you can imagine, especially when you're starting out with asset management, deciding which assets you're actually going to spend time managing and which ones you will actually just continue to manage almost without additional input. So some examples of that would be, obviously you're going to manage your generators, right? Your turbines, your spillway gates, all of the big stuff. But would you maybe just let things go from and to just let problems arise and then you'd fix them? Say the parking lot for your powerhouse. Maybe the washroom. Some of those, they're critical to people, but you aren't going to put a lot of engineering horsepower into watching, it's coming up with capital plans and determining when, how often you have to fix these things. So, and it comes down to really how much horsepower you can put into it from a company perspective. So what you do is you figure out which assets you are going to actively manage and which ones you're going to reactively manage, which is a decision in itself. I have also seen companies. Oh, sorry, Chris.
Yeah, I got a question. Might be more at the enterprise management level though, but it's to do with scope. But I can hold it until you finish your.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, so in the US, decommissioning
Yeah.
of projects, like if you look at what's going on the Klamath, for example, or so it's within the realm of of possibility for an owner to decide to decommission and remove a dam, right?
Mm.
So if we take, you've got other big players like a Brookfield, or they're always looking to buy assets, or in some cases sell assets. So if we take, buying projects, selling projects, decommissioning projects, would that be in the corporate bucket, or would that be more of enterprise management, and then asset management feeds into that?
Yeah. And you know what, Chris? That's what I've seen most typically.
Yeah.
So you'd end up, big, so acquisitions of companies typically done at a financial assessment. Will this make my company more money? Will it satisfy our, stakeholder or investor requirements, right?
Mm.
So, and picking on Brookfield as an example. So they're going to make the decisions whether to acquire another dam or a large asset. They're going to do that at a level above asset management. So more at a financial asset management side. And then comes the work of asset management. Now, if you were to talk about decommissioning a plant, that I would argue is within the realm of asset management. Because now you're looking at, you've got the risks of that plant and you're just determining how should I best invest, to keep or to retire to this plant. And that's of course where it ties into licensing as well, right? Because now you've got somebody to provide that assistance to help analyze what the best decision is. But yeah, I would say very typically like the seller buy decisions above asset management doesn't tip. I have seen the build a new plant, that one being done in the asset management group.
Yeah. Thanks.
So now this is my better picture of all of those processes to talk about. And actually, Chris, one of the ones I noticed that I don't have on here. So in my company, we had a separate group that did, they call it hydropower planning. They were the ones that would look at the increases in load to the company that the company was seeing because we were a complete provincial utility. And so they would actually be looking at that increase in customer load and determining when it was cost efficient to build another dam. So that process isn't really in here yet. That I would have called that a hydropower planning. They also, of course, are looking at your system planning. That was the other group. So they would look at it systemically. Did you need to add transmission? Did you need to add new supplies to different towns and cities?
Mhm.
So those processes also get dragged into asset management because really they're investment decisions. But what I've seen, for at least from my history, is those groups are so well established and have such documented uh, processes that it takes a while for them to get dragged in. Another one that I've also seen that takes a while is your corporate um, the group that a corporate risk management group. You would think because they typically tend to be established at a high level and where they're looking at overall corporate or business risks. But really, asset management is all about risk. So how do you get those two groups together? I've in talking to various uh, electric utilities, what I've seen is that one tends to send almost report to the executive and be standalone, and then asset management feeds the major risks from assets up to that group. That's the way I've seen that work. So you can imagine now, like if I drew every process, that this would get kind of ugly. These
But
are the
just
ones that,
a good, let's say, higher level approach would be for existing assets, you know, asset
yeah,
management prevails and
yeah,
relative to future load on your system, that's more of like a grid planning function
correct.
that typically
Yeah,
sits outside of this. So in short, I mean, it's going to vary depending on your jurisdiction or company, but asset management, as we're discussing today, is it fair to say or safe to say that it applies to existing assets? I think is,
correct.
yeah,
Yeah.
with,
And
with
then
with a little gray in there. Yeah.
yeah, with a little gray, like for example, if you're thinking of proposing a new asset, in theory, that should be handed off to asset management for discussion, to see what the impacts would be, and get them to do the high level risk analysis as part of that. So
Okay.
they would be part of that planning. But
Like
at that point,
consulted
asset,
with. Yeah.
you got it. Yeah, yeah, it's a
Yeah.
consulted with if you're at a
Yeah. Yeah.
RACI. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's it. So that's really what this discussion was about on these first couple slides is you can imagine the asset management system scope. You have to decide which processes are in, which processes are out. And then each company starts off a little differently, wherever the main gains would be for investment. Great. Thanks. That was good to add to that, Chris. Okay. So this is a really important um, part for people to understand. And this is something that changes with asset management. So I don't know what your experience has been with making investment decisions in your company and how your particular companies do this. But uh, the intent of asset management is to make decisions based on risk and risk mitigation. So each company is as part of implementing asset management. The idea is to come up with a decision making or value framework. And I've heard this called a decision making methodology, a value framework, a corporate value framework. I've seen different names applied to this depending on how they use it. A lot of companies start with this when they implement a software called Copperleaf, which is put where they use it's software used to manage your capital plan. So it's asset investment planning. And one of the first things to do with that is to come up with a value framework. Now, ISO 55001 specifically requires that you have this framework, and it's one of the first things that you have to establish because you have to decide what criteria are you going to use to make decisions. And the most typical one I've seen is a value framework or a risk framework. Now, I put a really simplified one on this slide, but really what it comes down to is remember from our previous work on the stakeholders and the areas of risks that they identified? That's where you come up with your value count categories. So you can see the safety, dam safety, environmental, regulatory, cost, lost revenue, reputation, sustainability. These would be the basics for a hydro generation group, right? And I've always separated out cost and lost revenue because cost is more like your financial costs of the investment and or of the financial costs of the actual equipment failing. Whereas lost revenue is in a generation side is usually almost your biggest financial driver. Because if once you lose that revenue from a unit, that's your so anything that affects generation always has a higher priority because of that. And now what I would have people do is for the size of your company, I would have you looking at, what are impacts that would range from doesn't bother you very much to kind of bad and then to very, very bad. And typically when people come up with these matrices, they come up with values in each area that help them easily pick between categories. And remember, most things when you're talking about these impacts, when you're making the decisions, you don't have real data to look at it. So you want clear categories so you can easily pick, is it minimal or is it very bad? You want to be able to clearly pick between them. You don't want it to be like a 5 cent difference between each column. So that's where they use this to determine how to make decisions. They look at risks, your various value categories or risk categories, and then they look at establishing what is everything from minimal to very, very bad. And this is that decision making or value framework. And this is what you need in order to help you move forward with asset management. And it's lots of fun because you can imagine, depending on how large your scope is for asset management, if it's just generation, you can usually come up with this pretty well. If you're using it for just capital planning, it's pretty straightforward. But you can imagine if you're starting to use this for maintenance decisions typically don't have, a significant of an impact. So what you end up with is you're deciding between your minimal and not so bads. It stays in the bottom side of it. And if you now start to integrate between transmission, well, a lot of transmission failures, you'll see them start to add things like value categories of customers and reliability numbers, because in transmission, there's typically duplication. There's typically backup or multiple paths for transmission or for distribution. So the impacts from a single failure typically are not as large. So it makes it harder to make those decisions because you don't have that clear distinction. It didn't cost you $10 billion because you lost a unit. Now, the other concept that I wanted to introduce here with this value framework, this is another ISO standard to use where asset management came from, is a concept of risk as consequence times probability. So consequence is these impacts. And then if you look at risk as the probability of those impacts occurring, and that would be dictated by condition, it'd be dictated by the number you have, it'd be dictated by how that asset fails. You can use that to calculate risk. So that decision of using risk as consequence times probability is the basis for the decision-making framework for asset management. Okay. Now, to develop this, you can imagine for each company, they'd have to get a team together, and it takes a while. You'd have to try it out, to see how it works for your investments. And you have to ensure that the valuations are fair and applicable to the assets. And you have to look at your organization context. You have to look at your stakeholder requirements, the end system scope and type of decisions to be made, and risks and opportunities. And much of the work of asset managers is using the value framework and assessments of probability of failure to assess risk, and then developing investment alternatives. This is that whole idea of planning. identifying risks and opportunities, and then figuring out different investment alternatives. And that's why we spend, as an asset manager, you spend so much time in this area. So key, very key, and you'll see in the example of the SAMP that we're looking at today, they've pretty well defined all of this.
Is this fairly consistent, Don, across most hydro utilities?
So the answer is no. So
Oh.
the value categories, yes, Chris.
Yeah.
Matter of fact, especially the main ones, no, absolutely.
Yep.
But the consequences, no, because it's very dependent on the size of the utility. And matter of fact, that some companies, because they have such a big range of assets, uh, they they actually come up with multiples to help them make decisions on small plants and big plants. Because otherwise, what would happen is you'd never put any money into small plants because the big plants would get everything. So you can imagine they uh, they would have a budget target for big plants and a budget target for small plants, and then they would use a, a a matrix like this to help make the decisions for each of them.
Understood. But from a benchmarking perspective, so let's say I worked for um uh TVA, for example. Um I would be inclined to want to go benchmark with the core, I'm
Yeah,
guessing, because the categories to your point are consistent, but
yeah,
maybe the impact matrix would be similar.
yeah. So that this is another funny thing I ran into. So all the
Yeah.
people that put in Copperleaf, they sign a contract that they won't share their value framework.
Oh, no way. Interesting. Okay. I guess I could see why that could be confidential.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
because Copperleaf makes a bunch of consulting money redeveloping
Oh, no,
it for
but
every
even from a
company.
utility, yeah, fair. But even from a
Yeah.
utility, oh, so you're saying it's not confidential on the utility side, it's confidential on the software side. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Correct. Yeah. And then he actually signed because it was one of their big things, this value framework. But now it's an ISO, right in the ISO standard that everybody has to have it. But I know I've asked companies to share their value frameworks, and they actually haven't been able to because of the Copperleaf contract requirement. But they did share that. So these value categories I have here, those eight, those are pretty common between companies. So now this is the next step of using that value framework, and that's asset criticality. So the the what you need to know as an asset manager is what are the assets that are most important to me? And because those are the ones that, again, I should be spending my engineering, my analysis time, and my O&M time, what that I should be working on. So this is actually one of the first steps with asset management, and I would say that it's key to proceeding with asset management because you can imagine sitting in a hydro plant. My experience with a hydro plant is that there's typically about 750 asset types. Uh, you're going to end up with about 100 assets per unit, plus your balance of plant assets, plus your spillways. So say 1,000 to 1,500 assets per plant. Now, if you add all of your transmission stations, all of your, if you have HVDC converter stations, if you happen to have some thermal plants, the thermal plant's about 15,000 assets. You start, you need to know before you're as an asset manager, which assets are the most important. And so one of the first applications of the value framework is to evaluate the consequence of failure from assets in your portfolio. And if you look at the ones that have the highest consequence, and those are your critical assets. And using some words, I got this from one of the utilities. They used it to filter the ocean. So you've got this ocean of assets to look at, and you have to figure out which are my most important ones because that's where you move forward. And you look at those first, and it also helps you to determine the level of management or assessment that will be applied. So if it's critical, those are going to be the ones that you are going to have your inspections, that you're going to have online monitoring, that you're going to have all of this good stuff so you can ensure the condition of those critical assets. I put these pictures off on the side because one of the things that, um, oops, sorry, uh, asset owners are often surprised when they look at criticality because they'll find that they've missed things. Maybe they knew about it at one time, but because things weren't documented, people changed, all of this good stuff. One of the examples I ran into was bridges. People had everybody's got an access road to get into their power plants, right? Well, who really looks at that road? Who does road inspections? And then everybody's crossing a river to, big or small, to get into your plants, right? And so bridges surprisingly popped out at one of these places where I was working. And then, if electrical stuff, well, there you're looking at, maybe you'll find a place that really, a key interconnect, maybe part of your ring bus, maybe an extra breaker wasn't being looked at. All of these things, you'll be surprised the thing that pops up when you look at criticality. And the intent with asset management is you should be able to run through your whole asset portfolio and run it by criticality and tell you what are your most important ones. And then you should make sure that there's work at those assets.
Don, so roads, bridges, the roof on your powerhouse.
Got it. Roofs
Do
was another
these
one, Chris, actually.
do these all fall into the balance of plant bucket, or do they have their own
I
categories?
typically I typically put them in different categories, yeah.
Okay.
And
Okay.
so the roof on the powerhouse,
Yeah.
that one I actually would be, it's around buildings and structures.
Okay.
But the weird one on a powerhouse roof is that losing your roof, you actually could lose generation, right?
Yeah. Leaky roof's a
So
leaky
it's a
roof. Yeah.
yeah, leaky roof, and if it happens to go, the water goes down in your exciter, you've lost the unit, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No kidding. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that would be a
Yeah. I was just gonna say, like, if your balance of plant category is too broad, mixed bag of dogs and cats, for example,
yeah,
wouldn't you run the
yeah.
risk of maybe missing something? Like,
Absolutely. So
yeah.
I tend to put a group in, and you'll see that the people in their computerized maintenance management systems will do that. They'll put like roads and grounds,
Yeah.
what would be a category. Then you would have buildings or
Mm,
facilities, and that
mm,
way and the other thing you find is that you manage buildings the same,
mm,
right? So a building is a building, is a building, with the
mm,
one exception being the one that you talked about, which is the powerhouse.
mm.
Because that one's special because it's over top of the equipment. Yeah, you bet. And then the other thing that they would be separate would be your spillways. So your water control facilities and then your water containment, because all of
Mhm.
those are separate. And they also tend to be managed by very distinct groups. So the water control and water containment tends to be managed by dam safety, and you follow dam safety standards.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny as you start to group, and you've hit on something that's really important, is starting to group those assets. And that, because your asset classes determine the type of work you carry out. So
Mm.
that's one of the next steps that happens. You bet. So we're now at the next section, which is leadership. And I'm just looking over. We were supposed to be at dum, 11 through
So,
12:30. Are we a little early? We're a
well,
little late.
2.2, yeah. Yeah, this is still part of the context, right? So,
Yeah, that's true.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, we're just moving to leadership, which is the next one. So context of the organization. Okay. Yeah, so I see it's both together. That's why. Aha. Why I'm feeling like I'm actually doing well. So part of leadership is your commitment, asset management policy, and the roles and responsibilities. So leadership commitment. So this is one of the key features. If anybody's ever done change management training, and asset management is no different than anything else. If you want asset management to be successful, you have to have clear, documented leadership that communicates to people what they're supposed to be doing and is committed to the work and ensures there's people to actually do the work and all of that good stuff. So it's responsible for ensuring that there's found, what the foundational deliverables are, the resources, organizational change and alignment. So if you have to change the organization at all to facilitate asset management, all that communication. So making sure there's communication about asset management and what the deliverables are supposed to be, driving continuous improvement because that has to come down from the top as well, and ensuring that decision making is created and followed. Because if your leadership does not use the decision making methodology, that methodology quickly becomes invalid. And when people start to bypass some of those things. So very important that you have leadership and that it be documented. One of the first areas that leadership is responsible for is developing an asset management policy. So the policy signifies that the organization is committed to implementing asset management. It builds awareness, so it's typically short and it's posted in various places so that people know what asset management is about. And it provides a basis to develop the asset management related activities. So the policy is sometimes issued as a separate document using typical corporate policies, or sometimes it's part of the strategic asset management plan. The example that we'll be looking at today, it's actually part of that plan. So the policy requirements, one, that it be appropriate to the organization. You can imagine if you're a small utility, yeah, you're gonna have to, it doesn't have to be as broad. And it also, you have to decide, of course, if it's for transmission, generation, and distribution, and other businesses. It has to provide the framework for setting AM objectives, so it has to say how those are established. Provide the commitment to meet those requirements, commitment to continuous improvement, and it has to be consistent with other policies. That's wording almost right out of the ISO standard. Now, roles and responsibilities, very interesting. So I don't know if anybody has any input on how their asset management group is set up in your company. So one of the initial requirements of ISO is that you establish the roles and responsibilities for asset management. So you look at, is there any organizational changes or authority changes that are necessary? Because, you've now changed who's making decisions and how they're done. You're going to have new processes that to be established and old processes to be coordinated. And it's asset management will now be providing recommended investments to the executive and recommends processes to and requires data from existing groups. So now you've really even changed the way that data flows or recommendations flow within your company. So if you look at it now, this is a high level, showing some of the processes that are typically in a hydro utility. So you can see you're going to have IT, you're going to have HR, your asset operations, your safety, engineering groups, finance, projects. Now, all of a sudden, again, now you've added your asset management group. So thinking of that, before asset management existed, the flow would have been probably from your engineering group or from finance directly up to the CEO for making recommendations for investments. So now you've taken asset management, and asset management is now working with asset operations and engineering and projects and power planning to now coordinate a lot of these processes and provide the recommendations for investment. So you can imagine how the dynamics of your company change when you add that. So now what I've shown you here is a centralized group for asset management. In many companies, you actually see decentralized asset management. And this happens quite often, especially when people are just starting. So now, if you look here, so you've got your, the same drawing as the other side, but now generation has got their asset management group with operations projects, all that other stuff. And then there may be another business unit, say your transmission group or your distribution group, and they would be organized similarly. So now you would have 3 or 4 or 5 asset management groups within your company. So you can imagine now, I've worked in both of these systems, and what happens with it with a decentralized system is it's much easier to implement initially. And one of the things you get is I think what I find it is it's a trade-off between communication and consistency. So if you're a generation asset manager, and that's what I was, and you're working for generation, communication is very good. You know all the players, you know all the people, you know all the processes. You can get asset management established much more quickly. But now if you've got another asset management over in transmission, another asset management group in distribution, another asset management group in HVDC, and another asset management group off, you can imagine now each one of those groups tends to develop all of their own independent processes that work within their group. And when the overall gain of asset management is coordination and efficiency, this very quickly becomes more difficult to manage. And in essence, what you could end up with, we talked about those decision-making frameworks. Each one could have its own decision framework. Each one could have its own work management processes. Each one could have its own capital processes. And pretty soon, you get the optimization within each group, but you don't get the optimization at a company level. So most companies over time start to move towards the centralized.
So Don, when you were generation asset manager, for example, did your peer in transmission report to the same boss as you, for example?
No, no, no. So they reported to their transmission manager, or actually the executive for transmission, and then there was an executive for distribution, and an executive for IT. All of these things are all separate, right?
But they've got to talk somewhere up top.
So the talking was, you'd hope, but it was all informal. It was all
Okay,
informal. So the asset manager groups would get together, but nothing, there's really nothing to force it together. So what finally happened is there was a central group established, and then there was reorganization around asset management. And I find that very typical with many companies. So that's what happened with mine. So I'm used to talking about it, but I've seen it, and probably each of you will relate depending on how many years you've been with your company. But there's always these, they centralize things for a while, right? And then people get pissed off. They find it, it becomes inefficient. Then they decentralize for a while. And companies seem to go through these about 10-year cycles between centralization and decentralization. And I think what happens is the customer service within the company gets too low when everything's centralized because you got to wait for everything, right? And that's the driver for decentralizing. So the thing with asset management, it really doesn't work as effectively decentralized. So this is one of the things that when you see asset management put in, how they organize the company and how they set it up, it really dictates all of those decision-making and coordination processes. So in summary, the ISO standard requirements include 7 aspects: organizational context, leadership planning, support, performance evaluation and improvement. Organizational context includes the stakeholder expectations, AM system scope, the AM system implementation, and the value framework. So you can see that establishes or sets the scene for how asset management will be carried out, and defines how decisions will be made. And asset criticality is derived from the value framework. And then we talked about leadership. So leadership describes the actions of the organizational leaders to ensure asset management success. The AM policy is signed off by leadership and documents how asset management will be carried out in the organization, how asset management objectives are identified, and the asset management roles and responsibilities. And we talked about some of the different ways that companies are organized to carry out asset management. So any questions on this section? 12. All right. Brings us to knowledge check number 1. So which of the following statements about the value or risks framework are true? The framework takes into account the organization's context, organizational objectives, and internal issues. The framework considers the scope of the asset management system and the range of decisions to be made. The framework assists with life cycle decisions, deals with risks and opportunities, and will support governance for decision making. The framework informs decisions on asset criticality. The framework is required to be aligned with or certified to ISO 55001. Or all of the above. Has everybody been putting their answers in the chat? See. Like your question mark, Chris.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the answer, of course, is F. Because you'll see that I'm bad for always making it all of the above. And after I've said that, now the next one won't be. But it's everything. So it is really key to moving forward with asset management. And it's formed based on the organization's context, organizational objectives, and internal issues. And it's required by, so all of those things are correct. So it's an F. Okay, planning. Now I'm just looking at so we were supposed to start that at 12:10 and we're 12:14.
Doing good.
Not bad. 4 minutes late. Getting slowly out of sync. Sorry about that.
All good. Doing good.
So this is a long section and it's meant to take us through our break and after, and then we've got an exercise after. So where we actually break up in this part doesn't matter as long as we get finished in about an hour and a half. So actions to address risks and opportunities is the first one. So depending on where you work in your company, you'll find you'll actually be part of processes to identify risks and opportunities. And that's really what you get paid for. So one of my bosses used to say it cost $1 million for every engineer that he had, because that's how many ideas they came up with each year. And as they got older, they cost more. So it's because your job is to be looking at things and to determine what's needed to keep the company going. So one of the first things that develops ideas is strategic planning. So you'll be there's typically a business strategic plan, and then there's a strategic asset management plan to do with asset management. I'll be talking about that in more detail as we go on. Maturity evaluation. So there is a process for taking a look at the requirements for asset management and determining how mature you are in each area. And then that determines where you should be investing work. Performance analysis. So there will be measures in your company of how your assets should perform and how your different processes should perform. From looking at that, you'll come up with ideas on how to invest money. Asset condition analysis. So you'll be looking at the condition of your assets. You'll be doing cost analysis. Where am I spending my money? What's costing me money? How can I improve that? Dam safety. Dam safety has a documented standard saying what you need to review on each year to determine if there are investments required to ensure the reliability of your dams. Licensing, you will have specific license requirements, and then the inability or ability to fulfill those requirements will identify ideas. You'll have incidents and failures, so you'll be performing a root cause analysis on those. You'll have maintenance analysis, so you'll be looking at your maintenance program, determining what needs to be improved. And then you'll have corrective actions and preventative actions from programs. So typically what I found is every management program that's in there, like your safety management, your dam safety, your environmental processes, environmental management system, They will have processes where you're identifying either responding to failures, that's a corrective action, or implementing changes on other systems, and that's a preventative action. That's an action before a failure occurs. So the whole intent of asset management is to identify actions proactively to enable planning and to measure effectiveness of the action. So the whole idea is to get all of these processes, you can imagine they've all been running for many years, and to get those ideas together and determine what investments will best address the risk from each of the opportunities that are identified by these programs or these processes. So because those processes were already in place, asset management initially provides a coordination function. And then because now with asset management, you've now got that risk analysis methodology, it'll ensure that risks and opportunities identified in the process are identified consistently using the organizational decision risk evaluation process. Now, some idea areas requiring special discussion. So strategic planning. So strategic planning is typically at the business level, so the executive level. Asset management may or not be part of that process. So Chris, you picked on that when you talked about the decision to buy or sell another company, right? Are we getting out of generation? Are we buying wind? All of those decisions? Those decisions are up here, strategic planning, right? At your business level. Quite often asset management responds to those decisions, right? So that's, like you said, they're consulted, but if somebody decides that they're going to go buy another company, that's typically based on the financial decision to do that. And then asset management responds because now there's just new assets added, new processes added, new people added. So that's why this is a special one to talk about. Safety. Safety is an established process within the company. Safety is considered as a risk, right, in your decision-making methodology. But there is likely that there's OSHA and OSHA standards for how you carry out your safety system, right? And there's requirements to have your safety meetings and to identify safety items. So all of those items, they become an identifier. So they're identifying actions. Same with dam safety, it's regulated environment. NERC. So when I'm coming up with my maintenance program, when I'm coming up with all my tasks I have to consider my NERC requirements, your license requirements, and then of course your overall target, power planning or system planning. So these are processes that, as an asset manager, they're established, they're documented. In some cases, there's laws that say how, this is how you must do it. So therefore, they continue on as per the regulation, and then they become inputs to asset management, or asset management is consulted as part of their work. So that's why, depending on where you sit in your company, you'll see some of these processes sit separately and continue on as if asset management almost doesn't exist in some place. Okay. There's a test at the end of this on how to produce this graph. Okay, not really.
No problem.
I stole this one off the internet because it matched all of our color schemes. That was what was important. It didn't matter how good the drawing was. So
Nice.
this is what's called a radar chart. I don't know if anybody's ever seen it, but these are the different aspects, 4.1 and all the way around to 10.3. If you were to look at the ISO standard, those are the standard requirements for asset management. And the way a radar chart works is so what you do is you measure the quality at which you're producing each of these areas. So, area 4.1 on a level from innocent, 1, to competent, 3, to excellent, which is 5. And the whole intent is to get to a competence level of 3 in all the areas of asset management in order to be compliant to ISO 55000. So if somebody comes in and does an ISO 55000 audit for you, They will be looking at each of these competence areas and assessing you from a value from 0 to 5. And then typically, if you are below 3, that would be an area to invest. And if you wanted to actually be compliant to the standard, it'd be something you'd actually have to get done before you're re-audited in order to ever get your ISO compliance. Now, most utilities in the United States are not going for compliance to ISO 55000. So what they would be looking at is they would have a similar audit done, but what you'd be looking at is what areas would I best invest in to improve the performance of my company? What would I best invest in? Again, it really comes down to addressing risk, improving organizational efficiency, providing me some sort of a financial gain. So a similar audit would be performed. And then, so you can see like this company, their first one, you can see where they were. They were down at 1 for a whole bunch of these. And matter of fact, I don't know, that even looks like less than 1. And then, they had a couple of good areas. So most companies, when they first do the initial audit, they will have a great capital program, or they'd have O&M covered because they'd have a good work management system, something like that. So you'd find a couple of areas that most companies are always pretty good at, but you'll find that, of course, all of the requirements that come brand new with asset management, you did the audit the first time, you just don't have it, right? Like, are you going to have an asset management policy right off the hop? Of course not. So companies tend to look at it, and then they slowly pick which areas will improve the company the most, and then they look at areas to improve. So I have a simpler version of that chart here. So this one I stole without telling anybody from the example that we're going to look at later today. And so you can see that this one, um, they were looking at their policy. They actually broke that chart out. So I'm just going to go back a little bit. You can group these requirements. You can see area 4.1 to 4.4. That is all the first requirements of ISO. Same with 5, same with 6, same with 7. So the simpler way of looking at that, whoops, and I just have to go that, this is now everything to do with strategy and planning, which is area 4. And you can see this is the couple of years of assessment. So here's an example of somebody, they started out and they were less than 2. And now they've managed to uniformly, by their next analysis, they've now managed to move all their performance levels up to 2. And so now they've fixed up their strategy and objectives, their demand analysis, strategic planning, and their asset management plan. So most companies that I know of that are in asset management, they do internal. They start off with a company to come in and do this analysis, and then as they learn about it, they put it in the audit process internally, and they assess how they're doing for performance. If they do decide to ever go to actually be compliant or certified to ISO 55000, then they would have an external auditor come in. This is one of the first starting points to get objectives in the strategic asset management plan. So you can imagine you have the audit, you look at how your performance is for each area, and you come up with your performance objectives. Those objectives will show up in the strategic asset management plan that I'll talk about next. So the next process I wanted to talk about is maintenance planning. So many of you are familiar, you probably have a maintenance program in your company. Some of that may be contracted out, some of it done internally. I know when I started, there was already maintenance happening in my company when I started. I mean, the company was started, in 1950. Plants had been in place since 1900. Obviously, they were doing maintenance on those units, from day one, right, to keep them up. So there was a maintenance program in place. How were those tasks established? How were they documented? over my life, they evolved from something that was written on a piece of paper. There was a card at each unit, and they used to, this is the maintenance that had to be done, and when people performed the maintenance, they'd write on the card. How somebody knew to send them out to do that maintenance, I have no idea. I guess really smart supervisors. Most of the work that evolved at that time was time-based. So people used to take a unit out of service every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, and they would have a set of tasks that they would carry out. And they would know that they had to, do their turbine cavitation maintenance. They would have to change the brushes. They'd have to do all their cleaning. There's a lot of time-based cleaning tasks. Those are the typical strategies that arose. Most manufacturer recommendations were time-based. You also run into maintenance that's age-based. So I'm picking on age, but it could be either physical age, so time-based replacement, or how old the unit was. So you just replace the bearings every 10 years. So that would be how often you replace it. You also, what evolved over time was condition-based maintenance. So condition was measuring some aspect of condition on the unit or on that piece of equipment. And then you would use that to determine if additional work was required. My definition between the two is that, the first couple would be called like an intrusive or preventative maintenance. And the condition-based typically turn into inspections. And they're often termed as predictive maintenance. So where you actually use that measurement to determine if the equipment is deteriorating. You typically wouldn't have to take that equipment out of service to do predictive maintenance. Matter of fact, that's my differentiator. If I have to take it out of service or whether I can just do it with it online. Over time now, you've seen people use more advanced terms. So the FMECA, which is failure mode effect and criticality analysis, reliability-centered maintenance, risk-based maintenance, and this one I've seen used quite commonly, which I call best practices, where that would be where you benchmark between utilities and determine what is everybody else doing on this piece of equipment. Because why? Because there's a lot of work to do these other ones, the FMECA, the RCM, risk-based maintenance, to go through those processes. Best practices is really, you can learn a lot just to see, how often other people doing these tasks. So once you've decided on each of those tasks, now let's see, I think I have a nice slide. So once you put in asset management, this is where the world starts to change a little bit. So I have found that asset management is a driver for you to define your failure modes. Because, we talked about in the previous section, we talked about that your decision-making framework. The consequences of failure are based on understanding what's failing and so you have to know how a piece of equipment fails, which is its failure mode. Once you understand how it fails, then you can come up with the consequences of failure. And then from there, then you can come up with what investments do you want to do to address those failures. So I found it more and more important over time to have those failure modes established for my critical equipment. And that's why you'll see that. So RCM is an example, and I've got that on this slide. And same with the FMECA. The first things you do is you define the function of the asset, to determine how the asset can fail to fulfill its functions, determine the causes of failure, and determine the effects for the failure, and then classifying the consequences. And then from there, you get to develop the tasks. So you almost end up, for your critical equipment, doing this failure mode analysis in order to understand its criticality and understand what actions are required in order to address failure. You end up doing that work. If you don't define it up front, and I've been down this path and made this mistake, if you don't do it up front, you end up doing it after. So you're going to end up finding those failure modes over time. this will help you explain why, to me, it's also important to define what your critical assets are, where you're going to be putting your time into. This takes time, right? To come up with your failure modes and then determine, what the consequences are, and then figure out what actions are required. To carry out this analysis at this level of detail means you only want to do this on the things that are very important to your company, right? It's just too much work to do this for everything. You're not going to do this on the bathroom fan. It's just not worthwhile, right? So, but are you going to do this on your generator, on your turbine, on your exciter, on your governor, on your spillway gates, on your switchyard breakers? Absolutely, right? Because that's where it's worthwhile justifying your maintenance program and justifying also capital investments that come out of this as well. So asset criticality. So we talked about this a little bit before this. So I could use that information from the FMECA, RCM, or a dedicated asset criticality analysis to come up with to give me my asset criticality. I think it's one of the things that's done first. That's why I mentioned it, at the beginning of our discussion today. But so the steps are you identify your asset portfolio, you determine your critical assets, and then you focus your initial asset management actions on your critical assets. That's where you'd spend your time. And as I mentioned, utilities are often surprised by the results of criticality analysis. Now, how is this often shown? So I have seen, and a lot of companies do this, where they actually come up with a chart or a matrix which plots consequence or impact versus the probability of failure. And they actually can come up with, a matrix that shows that they call it a risk matrix for your assets. And this works very well for showing which assets you should be spending money on. And so what you would end up with is any of the ones that are really bad would show up in the upper right. And then the ones further down with less consequence to you would start to show down, down in the green areas. So there are some positives and negatives with this. The positive I mentioned to you, it's pretty easy to use, and management loves to see red and green charts, right? Is there any managers on here today, Chris?
I'm sure. I don't have the list
Hey.
on me, but yeah.
If you're a manager, you can put up a hand and say how much you love to see red and green charts, right? They're easy to understand. I like them too. And matter of fact, I'm a pro for it on that. It's nice for me to see where I should be spending my money, because it's just so hard. You get lost in the weeds with your 150,000 assets to look at, right? The cons of this is that it's really not all that accurate, in that it's typically done um, with a without detailed FMECA input at the beginning. So people would go through and they'd assess the criticality at the beginning using that decision-making framework in the categories, but they're not doing it with data. They're doing it with an impression, right? With their understanding because they're asset experts. So typically they would come in and they would assess the criticality based on almost their gut feel assessment. So that's the negative. So if you ever hear people complaining about the asset criticality matrices or the method, it's because it's not based on data. You're not like a lot of what you will find with most assets in hydro stations is there's not a lot of failures that occur. And the reason for that is we've been doing maintenance work on them for many, many years. And so there's not a lot of failures. So the failure modes are addressed by existing work. People haven't seen those failures. It's not like if you go to the transmission world, uh, if you've got 100,000 towers, you can do a lot of true statistical analysis to come up with your failure modes and probability of failure. Whereas with a hydro plant, go to each one of your plants and see how many times the turbines failed. Right? Never. Right? The head cover. You should never have had a head cover failure. The shaft. How many times have the shafts broken? Right? So you really don't know what the probability of failure is of those assets, and so you're assuming it. So that's what they mean by these the inaccuracy of this, and unfortunately, that's just the way it is with hydro assets. I've also seen people assign an asset criticality ranking. So instead of using that criticality matrix, you've you can actually establish. So this one shows the criticality categories and the impact by each asset. I like this one. I've seen people put it in the computer as maintenance management system for their critical assets. So they would actually enter the criticality by the impact. So this is now the consequences only. So you notice there's no probability of failure. This is now just on the consequence of failure. And by consequence category, if you have a way of saving this by unit, it now is a nice way. You can now see what the actual impacts of the failure in each of the failure modes are. The other thing that people may do as well is they may use weightings for each criticality category. And it shows, oh, sorry. I'm not a believer that much, but I've seen it in use. So, because how would, like in my mind, how would you weight financial versus safety or reliability? To me, if the decision-making methodology should already have those categories in place. So you've already determined what's very high in each of those areas. I haven't felt a need to also have weightings between them. And I think I've always found that difficult to do. And whenever you can never get a satisfactory discussion on weighting finance versus safety. It just never happens. Safety is always number one. That's all there is to it. So the next, after you've gone through your criticality, one of the very first things that people start to do is looking at asset age to determine if there's investments required. And this is one of the very first things that you typically would do where you've never had asset management in place. So you can imagine you start asset management and you get your portfolio defined. And now you determine your criticality. So now you know which ones you're going to look at first. The next thing you're going to do is look at how old your assets are. And one of the first things, and this is the simplest way of determining if there's investments required, you're saying, well, how many of those assets are past their useful life? So now the first thing you're going to turn around and ask me, well, what's the useful life of each of my asset classes? And I will tell you that I have a book that tells me what the useful life is. There's a blue book that's established by the Bureau, and it's published, so you can go look for it. I should actually, if I was smart, I would have a link in here. But you can look at the useful life of all the different asset classes in hydro plants. And so one of the quick things you can do right off the hop is say, well, how many of my assets are well beyond their useful life? And they would be the ones that I should probably have a planned investment to repair or replace them. And so your very first thing that you do, and you will hear that a lot of people talk about aging investments. This is what they're talking about. They're talking about all these assets that people have are past the end of their useful life and whether they should have investments for them. And typically when people start asset management, they will find that they didn't have anything set up to replace these assets. And as soon as they start throwing those into the capital plan, their capital plan blows up because they just didn't have money in there for time-based replacement. And this really hits a lot of municipalities, city governments, where they, they just didn't have money in place for replacing roads and sewers and, all these things that do have a life, but they've never had money in place to replace on a time-based replacement program. They've never been set up for it. And this is where and of course, the more you defer it, you end up in more trouble, right? Because now things just get older and older, and you end up doing reactive replacements. Reactive replacements typically cost you about 6 times as much as a planned replacement. So it's where you just end up pushing it further and further downstream, and it just gets worse and worse. So this would be the very first. Now, this is all about planning, right? It's all about planning investments. This would be one of the very first things you would look at. My experience with hydro generators is that almost all hydro generators exceed what the useful life that you would find in the Blue Book. Blue Book or Black Book? I'm gonna have to go look for that link at lunch and make sure I have the right link. I'll put it in the chat. But almost every asset, especially the big ones, for the original older generators, they always exceeded the useful life. I've seen lots of units that were 40 and 60 years old, or 60 and 80 even, and still plugging along. The next thing you would do, once you get beyond age, so you can see where age typically gets you in trouble, right? Because a lot of things exceed their age if we do our proper maintenance and because they were well built initially. The next thing that you would move to is looking at asset health or asset condition to determine assets. Now, this is commonly called in hydro plants the asset health index. And you'll see most companies or many companies have developed means of establishing asset health based on a method of assessing health by asset class. And it's very typically, because it's a lot of work, typically they would start again on their critical assets. So you're going to see the turbine, everything in the turbine, all of the different parts of it. You can see the generator, all the parts of it, your generator breaker, your exciter, your governor, spillway gates. You're going to see asset health indices established for them.
Hey,
Now,
Don.
Yes.
Sorry. It's 12:45. This is an important slide, so maybe could we break, and then when we get back,
absolutely,
we could restart this one, just because we're getting into some good stuff here. I don't want to rush it, nor do I want to keep people from their break. So that's okay.
Exactly. I think break is much more important, because that'll help me get. I can drink my vat of coffee then.
Nice. All right.
Good.
So we'll take a half-hour break. We'll come back at 1:15 p.m. Eastern.
Sounds good.
Awesome.
That's great. I'll turn on my camera when I get back.
Yep, same. Thanks.